Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you on the other side of the world. My name is Rachel Silvey, and I'm the director here of the Asian Institute at the Munk School of Global Affairs. And it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome Professor Enze Han to speak about his new forthcoming book, his book that has just been published, I should say. Before I say a few more words about Professor Han, I'd like to say the land acknowledgement here in Toronto. We wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to work on this land. So welcome, Professor Han. There are many of us from all over the world looking forward to hearing about your new book. And what I'd like to mention to our viewers who are here is that if you'd like to submit questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom where you can type in your questions. And then I'll be able to share them with Professor Han at the end of his talk. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. We're very delighted to have you. You can go ahead.
Can I start?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought we were waiting. Thank you everyone for coming to this talk, and I thank you for University of Toronto to host this talk. So this book, the ripple effect, China's complex presence in Southeast Asia, is essentially my attempt to respond to some of the general interest in currently China's global reach, right? And many people have talked about the phenomenon of global China as basically showing multiple dimensional influences across various sectors in politics, in economics, and in culture. For example, such as Qin Huang Li talked about global China has taking many myriad forms and have influenced many sectors and many corners of the world. So my starting point in responding to people's interest in how to understand China's influence is starting with a theoretical discussion, particularly international relations. Many people are interested in the difference between power in the case of China as a rising power, and also how these power are translated into influence, right? So basically, people have conceptualized how to understand influence is basically the act of modifying or having impact upon another actor's preferences or behavior in favor of one's own aims. So we can see that in this kind of conceptualization, influence involves a certain sense of intentionality, right? In a way that there is this particular actor, and usually this is the state, Chinese state that people are interested in, and also this is the intended outcome the state tried to achieve a particular aim. And I think that has often been the most common ways of trying to present or trying to look at China's influence from the state and its intention. However, in this book, I particularly looking at particularly interested into explore, other than the Chinese state, how can we incorporate a variety of non-state actors coming out from China or associated with China, and how to understand their implications or how that presence leads to, let's say, either intended or unintended consequences or influences, right? So this is basically in some way also engaging with some sociological theories about how we account for many instances where things happen as unanticipated consequences of social action. So with that very short introduction in terms of some of the theoretical perspectives, basically I'm looking at both non-state and non-state actors related with China, and then the implications of their presence in Southeast Asia lead to either intended or unintended consequences in terms of implications for how we feel the presence of China in Southeast Asia. So first, also, I would like to say something about why China versus Southeast Asia, or why specifically is focused on China, Southeast Asia relations, or China's influence in Southeast Asia. And obviously, this is the area of my research, right? But again, because that's why I work on China relations with Southeast Asia for quite some time. But then again, I do think Southeast Asia is quite distinct in comparison with other regions of the world in terms of its relation with China. And there are a few factors, I think, that make China's presence in the region particularly different. So first one is geographical proximity, right? I think people, I think sometimes this kind of the proximity to China, either sharing long borders, either land borders or maritime borders, make the relationship between these two geographically proximate. And then also there is a very long, complicated history of intertwinement for either political changes within China through dynastical changes as well as revolutionary changes and its implications with Southeast Asian societies. But also more importantly, I think Southeast Asia stands out from other parts of the world as a result of a long history of Chinese migration and its migration encounters between Chinese persons with societies in Southeast Asia in general that created a very intimate relations between these two, let's say, regions, right? And also these days, Southeast Asia is kind of the center for geopolitical competition. And that's why I think to understand China's relation with Southeast Asia has some element of either, on the one hand, it's quite unique, I would say, because it's a proximity and it's intimate relations. But also, I think hopefully the talk will have more wide implications for how to understand China's presence in other parts of the world. All right. So the main argument of the book is that we need to understand China's influence in Southeast Asia. We not only need to examine the Chinese state and its policies, but also the substantial impact of Chinese non-state actors on state-society relations in Southeast Asia. So basically, in the book, I basically look at both the Chinese state as well as variety of non-state actors coming out from China, and as well as how to categorize or how to understand in different areas where certain instances, for example, there is a very clear intentionality of influence versus in many other situations, things happen simply out of unintended kind of actions carried out by a variety of actors. So I will look at today I'll present three areas, right? Basically three chapters in a way. So the first one, I will talk about economic areas, which is more specific in a way, direct in a way to understand China's economic presence in Southeast Asia has led to certain changes in the region. And I'll also talk about a case on authoritarianism, right? In a way, how to understand the role China plays in variety of authoritarian governments in Southeast Asia, right? Whether we can draw a link between the Chinese authoritarianism versus the authoritarian states in Southeast Asia. And then finally, I will also talk about a quite mundane case of how Chinese consumption had led to a chain effect on Southeast Asian, let's say, environmental changes. Okay. So the first one obviously is kind of most straightforward, right? In a way that basically why today, for example, people are interested in Southeast China in relation to Southeast Asia is because the substantial amount of economic engagement between these two regions. Particularly since 2020, Southeast Asian nations, ASEAN, has become China's largest trading partner, right? So this is basically these days this kind of substantial amount of trading relations between the two has been obviously an outcome of, on one hand, the substantial amount of economic growth within China, its demand for, let's say, products from Southeast Asia. On the other hand, it also is a reflection of the ongoing trade war between China and the US, particularly since the Trump administration that implemented, let's say, tariff on Chinese made in China products. So this has led to a substantial amount of, let's say, on the one hand, lots of relocation of Chinese manufacturing sectors to Southeast Asia, but also lots of, let's say, people will call it transshipment of goods, right? In a way that goods, in fact, still made in China, but then transshipped through particularly countries such as Vietnam and Malaysia, and as well as Cambodia, basically as made in Vietnam products, but in fact, basically are Chinese-made products, but then somehow still destined for US and European markets, but then as a way of transshipping through Southeast Asia. That is actually quite a substantial amount of volume increase since 2020. And also, I guess, for people who are very interested in the topic of like Belt and Road Initiative, right, in a way that, I mean, that people has spent a lot of, effort to discuss the grand strategy on Belt and Road. But for Southeast Asia specifically, this is a region that China has invested substantively on infrastructure development. And so one of the, let's say, landmark project, right, these days is the high-speed rail project that it aims to link China with Southeast Asian countries, particularly from Kunming, ideally, right, it eventually will reach Singapore. So then this book, for example, talked about specific aspects of this, the construction and also first negotiation, right, between China and the various governments in Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, from Laos, Thailand, and Malaysia, in terms of that various modes of negotiation, and in the end, the implementation, right? So for example, in Laos case, the railway has been completed and is in operation, right? And in fact, this photo I took myself in December, and basically the railway has been running quite smoothly in a way, linking China with Laos, carrying both cargo and as well as passenger trains in the country. And it has substantively changed the understandings of geography and time, right? For example, the train from Vientiane to Luang Prabang these days only takes 2 hours. And previously, bus would take more than 10. So I think that has led to substantive amount of changes for Laos in terms of its infrastructure and in terms of also how it will impact the tourism sectors in the country. That a substantive amount of foreign tourists these days, for example, particularly from Thailand, has come to Laos to experience this high-speed rail. And similarly, in Thailand, there is still ongoing, right, construction, but with tremendous amount of political delays. And similarly in Malaysia, the East Rail link is ongoing in construction, and then sort of a project will be completed by 2027. Also, I think in Southeast Asia, there is these days, there's tremendous amount of effort for domestic Chinese capital to go overseas, right? Chuhai, that has been discussed so prevalent, so pervasively these days to encourage domestic capital to find alternative markets and go abroad. So in this particular case of outbound, when we look at outbound Chinese private capital, and then Singapore in particular has been crucial as a springboard for overall Chinese investment to Southeast Asia, then they will go to Singapore first and then make Singapore as the center for many of its business operations in the region. So that means quite a lot of Chinese, let's say, big companies, right, have now utilized Singapore as their headquarters for their overseas operations, from TikTok, from ByteDance, right, and then also from many Alibaba and many others. Basically, has made use of Singapore to as a way for its regional expansion. And in this particular case, and I also discussed in Southeast Asia how many, let's say, Chinese EV sectors, for example, have made use of Southeast Asian countries, particularly Thailand and Indonesia, as a way of expanding its regional presence. So in this particular case, when we think about economic relations, the causality is relatively straightforward in a way that the state has directed a very strong focus on its relation with Southeast Asia for either to bypass the political pressure that US has on China, and then has led to a proliferation of economic engagement with the region. Now, the second case I'm going to present is basically how to understand authoritarianism in Southeast Asia. Many people have talked about the effect of rising China as authoritarian government and its implication, right? So Jessica Weiss, for example, has talked about has China demonstrate, for example, how autocracy can work, and it also made cheap financing available, and then also there's export of technology to monitor people that governments around the world can buy, so this is basically an effect people have tried to theorize in terms of how a authoritarian China has affected, for example, other governments around the world, whether China is helping, right, to make those authoritarian governments more resilient. Now, on this particular question in Southeast Asia, and we do see quite substantial amount of authoritarian governments in the region, and in particular in mainland Southeast Asia, more so than maritime Southeast Asia, in a way that there are quite a few, right, say, these distinct authoritarian governments from Myanmar, Cambodia, also Vietnam, and then in some ways Thailand as well. So the question is, given let's say mainland Southeast Asia as much proximate to China, given mainland Southeast Asia has in fact quite a lot of authoritarian governments, is that particular linkage, right, between those authoritarian governments in Southeast Asia and then the China's presence? So for this particular area, and then I actually looked at different modes of Chinese influence that has either directly or indirectly or intentionally, or either intended or intended, that led to the resilience of authoritarian governments in the region. So I specifically would look at the three modes, right? In this case, basically, the first one is Myanmar. There is very much an explicit support for the military government. And then the second case I looked at is how, by engaging economically with Cambodia, by providing a substantial amount of aid for the country, has indirectly led to the performance legitimacy of Hung Sen's government, and in the end, sustained, let's say, in a way, the regimes in Cambodia. And finally, I also look at a peculiar case, in a way, Thailand, where there is not a direct linkages between China's presence and then the authoritarian governments in the country. Rather, it is domestic authoritarian forces within Thailand is making use of China to empower themselves, to sustain themselves in the country. So that is more of an unintended kind of a case of how authoritarian resilience is related with the China's presence. So the first case is Myanmar, and I think people, particularly tragic story of resilient, how to say, the military crackdown, and also the, let's say, the democratic uprisings and revolutions going on, right? Militarized kind of conflict in the country, and then and I think in this particular case, China has played a very explicit role, right, in either recognizing the legitimacy of the military government, or in some instances by empowering, right, the military government by arms sales and then economic engagement with the regime. So this case, in this particular case, right, there's a very explicit linkages, right, between the Chinese government's support at international organizations, particularly United Nations, by sheltering the military government, and also since the coup in 2021, at various levels of diplomatic engagement by either directly engaging with junta, as well as, for example, provide a forum, a platform for the military since then, right? So in this case, and I think it's very clear that in Myanmar's case, I think the authoritarian government, the military government, its presence, right, in some instances, to some degree, has been empowered by the explicit support provided by Beijing. The second case I looked at Cambodia. Now, in Cambodia's case, in a way that the government in Cambodia is not as isolated as Myanmar, right? So in some way, there is no international sanction or embargo or boycotting of Myanmar. So in that case, Cambodia does not really require China's diplomatic protection, right, in a way that is not necessary. So in Cambodia's case, in a way that you can see that the authoritarian government, right, in place, from Hun Sen and then also this day to his son, in a way is domestically originated, right, in a way that has deep roots with the post civil war Cambodia. But then in this particular case, we see that China as the main benefactor for the Cambodian government and its economy, right, given a substantive amount of economic presence in the country. For example, a quarter of Cambodia's FDI came from China, and also almost half of Cambodians' aid, ODA, official development aid. For example, in 2019, half of Cambodians' ODA came from China, which financed 70% of Cambodians' infrastructure, right? So that in some ways, we can see that many of those, let's say, public goods, right, that otherwise Cambodian government could not easily provide for its citizens are in fact being provided for by China's aid to the country. So one of the good examples of that would be, Cambodia, as even though it's one of the poorest country in Southeast Asia, but in fact, it was the country in the region that has vaccinated most amount of its citizens after Singapore, right? So basically second in the region, other than the rich Singapore, and Cambodia, in fact, reached very high level of vaccination and a very quick vaccination of its citizens during COVID time. And the reason is because all of Cambodians' COVID vaccines were donated by Beijing. So in this kind of case, we can see that China's economic presence and help for ODA, aid money for Cambodia has footed the bill for many of Cambodian government's projects, right? So that indirectly lead to the improvement efficiency, as well as somehow lead to the performance legitimacy of the Cambodian government. The last case on Thailand, in a way that I think it's people it's empirically very difficult to draw a link between the two, right? In a way that first of all, Thailand is not internationally isolated. Has much in fact was a treaty ally of the United States, and Thailand also does not, economically speaking, China not that crucial for Thailand in a way that Japan continued to be the largest investor for Thailand. But then in Thailand's case, what we see is that domestic polarization between, let's say, the royal military kind of conservative forces in the country versus the pro-democracy opposition. And then what's happening in Thailand is very explicit by the effort by the conservative forces to make use of China's presence to empower themselves. So this is in some ways is how should say the make use of the China model, right, as a way to justify the need for law and order, and basically how should say so in some way in this particular case is more of domestic actors within Thailand make strategic use of the China card to empower themselves to stay in power. So in that sense, right, in Thailand's case, the long, let's say, resilience of the military, right, in some ways also is domestically originated. But then again, it's ongoing sort of persistence, right, has the China's role is in some ways very indirect, and it's, in fact, the agency is more on part of the domestic authoritarian forces within the country rather than China alone. And finally, I'll also present a mundane case of how Chinese consumption had led to, on the one hand, maize cultivation in Myanmar, and also in the end lead to deforestation in northern Myanmar. So this is basically a chapter specifically look at Chinese consumption, right? You know, as the size of the country, right? 1.4 billion people start to consume as its economy upgrades, and then there is, you know, rising demand for meat, for tropical fruits, for many other things. So, when we think about deforestation in Southeast Asia, and in particular, I think for Myanmar, that there has been a very accelerated pace of deforestation in northern part of its country. You know, according to the Global Forest Change data set, for example, since you know, between 2000 and 2019, right, there is a very much high rate of deforestation going on in the country. Now, previously, many people have talked about deforestation in Myanmar as a result of the timber trade, right? And timber trade previously, China actually played a very important role, right? Because, you know, lots of timber actually were destined to the Chinese market. But since around 2010-ish, the government actually banned the export of raw timber, and then then what is happening, and in some way coinciding with Myanmar's domestic economic reform, right, opening up during around Deng Xian government in 2010-11, and then there is also a parallel agricultural transformation in the country. So this, in some way, had to do with some global forces and some are Chinese roles. First is that around 2010-ish, 11, 12, these years, there is basically a jump in global commodity price, particularly for corn, right? So basically, the corn price has gone up significantly around 2000 after 10, 11. And then that basically make this is a very much more pricey than before. So what's interesting is that there is also within China itself, there is a very sort of on one hand, it's basically rising domestic consumption of meat and an expansion of the animal meat market, right? And then this rising consumption of meat, for example, today, China is the largest importer of beef, right? So that is kind of indicator of how much, you know, Chinese people are consuming in terms of you know, beef, pork, chicken, and many other proteins, but as a result of its economy has upgraded than before. So that means there is expansion of domestic animal feed market, particularly for chicken farms and pork farm, pig farms, etc. So in this particular case, that in much of there is a huge demand, right, for the feed market, and then there is basically, particularly for corn, there is in some ways, interestingly, is that domestically Chinese price for corn is actually more expensive than international market price. The reason for this high price for corn domestically is that corn is one of the 4 grains that the Chinese government put as a sort of a food sustainability kind of item. So basically put high tariff on the quota on in how much corn can be imported directly into the country. And then and so that's why domestically corn in China is in fact even more expensive than international price, even though international price has already gone up from 2000 to 10, 11, 12. So that means that the price for corn is so high in China, and then given, let's say, Myanmar's geographical proximity to China, sharing a long border between the two, that means there is basically a natural outlet, right, for Myanmar's maize, the corn produced in the country, particularly northern part of highland, to go across the border, sort of a long porous border between the two countries, and then basically can easily transport it by trucks, and as well as sort of the variety of other land modes of transportation into China. And then so that means that likewise there is expansion of maize cultivation in northern Xi'an state. So these are the data I got from the global forest change data set, right? And then so then we can see how, for example, by looking at different regions in the Xi'an state in northern Myanmar, and how there has been basically a rising sort of rates of deforestation, particularly in northern Xi'an state. Basically, these red dots that's pretty much happened after 2010. And in some ways as well, the forest that has been lost is much more in the northern Xi'an state during this period than the eastern part of Xi'an state as well, and the southern part of Xi'an state. So in some ways, this has direct linkages to the cultivation of maize as a response to the domestic needs, market needs in China. So that means in this particular case, right, deforestation is happening in Myanmar, right, as well as in Laos, in fact, to the maize cultivation. So people have talked about this kind of agricultural transformation that has been going on in upland Southeast Asia for the past decade. And then one of the main factors that is driving this deforestation, right? Other than the previous timber trade, is basically this expansion of maize cultivation, right? So and this maize cultivation is also directly linked to the domestic market demand within China that has led to this chain effect within the region, right? But we cannot easily join a link saying that, oh, deforestation in Myanmar is because the Chinese state won deforestation in the country, in Myanmar, right? There is no sort of direct linkages between these two, right? And in fact, it is a mundane set of actors, right, coming out from China, basically, let's say the seed companies, how should you say, the smugglers across the border, etc. Is these kind of actors basically are the ones that is driving the force of deforestation as well environmental changes in Southeast Asia. So this is in some ways a very much unintended kind of consequence, right, as a result of the scale of China in terms of 1.4 billion people and its geographical proximity that has led to significant amount of changes in the region. So this, in fact, is what I'm talking about, right? This is a ripple effect in a way that how can we conceptualize the size of China and then its multifaceted kind of a presence within Southeast Asia, and then how what kind of influence and as well unintended consequences can we observe within the region. And then specifically, and I think I intentionally try to, on the one hand, obviously account for the state, because which is, oftentimes people tend to focus on the Chinese state, but then in reality, also there are a lot of lots of these kind of non-state actors basically are also actively involved that make the Chinese presence being felt. So I will talk a little bit more about some of the outline of the book, and I think a few chapters I think I didn't really cover, right? So today I talked about authoritarian resilience, trade, investment, economic influence, and also Chinese consumption. But there are a few other ones I think people probably are also going to be interested in. I also talked about illicit political economy. I don't know whether people are familiar, but there's lots of say criminal networks coming out from China that is now rummaging through Southeast Asia, right? Like with casinos, with scammers, etc. So they are often conflated as China, right? In a way that China is because of China, that's why there's lots of crime in Southeast Asia. But then these are non-state actors, right? They are criminal networks, and in fact, they are banned by China government. But then somehow they found shelter in Cambodia, in Myanmar, etc. Then basically has proliferated and has led to a very wide sort of range of negative consequences for crime rates and other things for Southeast Asia. And also, I talked about migration encounters in terms of how let's say, waves of migration coming out from China, even with recent kind of sort of arrivals, right? As people come to Southeast Asia to study, to retire, to work, and then how they encountered with earlier waves of Chinese migration in the region, and has led to, let's say, on the one hand, let's say, state effort to engage those diaspora communities, and then as well as implications for managing the relations between various countries. So finally, as a promotion for the book, if you order from the Oxford University Press website, and if you put in this online order, there's a sort of a code, right? This code, you'll get 30% off if you purchase from OUP website. So I will stop here, and then I'll be very happy to answer some of your questions and the comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This really gives us a lot to think with, and a lot of wonderful questions I'm sure will be coming in. I'd like to remind the people who are listening in that you can submit your questions down to, there's a Q&A button at the bottom, and I'll be able to see your questions and share them with Professor Han as he continues to think aloud with us about this book. The other piece I wanted to mention before we jump into questions is that part of the reason we were here at University of Toronto, we're really excited to sponsor this book talk, in addition to the excellence of your scholarship more generally, is the Asian Institute, along with the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies, has developed a project called the Belt and Road in Global Perspective. And I wanted to thank the Belt and Road in Global Perspective, which is a project initiated by Professor Ed Schatz here in political science, for that support of this talk and your visit. So I have a few questions, but I'll share with you the ones that come up that seem really quite relevant to some of what's in the book. And I should also mention to everyone who's listening that the book is wonderfully accessible. It has a tremendous amount of deeply thought and rich empirical material, but it also has this delightfully accessible style that makes you really read it as a page turner as well, which is a very complicated balance, and I really, really commend the author for that success. So this is a question from Rick Wilson, and he is wondering if you could say a bit about Vietnam in particular, a little bit more about it and its relationships with China.
So in Vietnam, I did not really cover too much in Vietnam, but I did mention basically in the authoritarian resilience chapter. In some ways, the how should say the resilience of the Vietnamese Communist Party and its government, in fact, has how should say that. Is not the relationship is even weak to draw a linkage between the two, right? In a way that Vietnam, in many ways, the government play on the anti-Chinese sentiment within the country, right? So that means that the sustainability of the resilience of the Vietnamese Communist Party has even less to do with the Chinese communists in that sense. But in terms of economically speaking, I think Vietnam is the main benefactor for the trade war, right? So then we can see that from the trade volumes that going on between China and Vietnam in the past few years, as a result, as I mentioned, this kind of a transshipment, right, of goods from China that either go through one step of additional sort of layer of packaging, and then there will be then is how should say leads to, let's say, the issue of a new certificate of origin, right? That is made in Vietnam products, and then go to the US. And so Vietnam in particular has been being highlighted as one of the main country where substantive amount of Chinese goods are transshipped from Vietnam. And then there's also another factor, and I think Vietnam also plays a significant role on, is the so-called the Xinjiang factor. I also talked about this sort of they call it a cotton washing, right? So basically, it's made basically the cotton produced in China, and then they will be shipped to Vietnam, and then they'll be mixed with other cotton from other parts of the world, and then be produced used in textiles. So which means in the textile factories. And then so in the end, those textiles, even though for the US put sanctions on Chinese-made cotton, but ultimately still end up in the markets in Western department stores. So that, in a sense, I would say Vietnam, in this particular case, on the one hand, benefit tremendously from this trade war between China and the US and the West in general. But also Vietnam, in some ways, helped, right, in this particular case, that basically providing an avenue through which much of the Chinese goods still continue to go to the Western markets. So these are two factors. These are two areas that I did discuss when we get to the case of Vietnam. But I stayed away from, let's say, territorial disputes, right? And that's area of high politics, and then in a way that I think many people have talked about substantively. So that's why I didn't really cover.
That's really interesting. So that sort of explains already what part of your answer will be to the next question. But this is from Ragini Panwar.
Right.
And she's asking, to what extent does China's territorial claim in the South China Sea negatively impact its relations with Southeast Asian nations? And how do the Southeast Asian nations manage this concern with other facets of their relationships with China?
Right. So territorial disputes, right, and it definitely is one of the, how should I say, the conflictual points between the Chinese government and several Southeast Asian governments, in particular Philippines and Vietnam. And then, you know, as I mentioned, this topic is one of the, like, say, high politics kind of question, and then also in some ways has been covered by so many authors. And to be honest, though, I don't think my own contribution would lead to anything new, right? So that's why I did not really talk about in this book. This book is more of a talk about, this book mainly is about some of the areas that people previously don't really talk about. And that's why I sort of cover these areas. But then to answer your question, I think China's territorial claims significantly worsened its relations with the Philippines and Vietnam. I will say these two countries specifically. So that means on the one hand, there is government level, right? There is this with particularly Philippines, right? There's ongoing sort of tension, right? In terms of the deployment of marine patrols and etc. in those areas. But on the other hand, it's continued to sour domestic public sentiment in these two countries toward China. So that's why it's no wonder, right? If you look at some of those, let's say, surveys carried out in Southeast Asia, the two countries that are most hostile to China tend to be Philippines and Vietnam, right? So this is in some ways directly related with the actions of the Chinese state in terms of its aggressive tactics, right, in its territorial claims within the South China Sea. But it's not as significant a factor, for example, when we get to Malaysia or Indonesia. They are much less, let's say, politicized than in Philippines and Vietnam.
Thank you. Thank you. So this next question is from Julia Bentley. And she says, great presentation. Thank you for a great talk. Can you comment on any concerns in Southeast Asia about the impact on domestic politics of the presence of Chinese state and non-state actors beyond the examples given? For example, in countries like Malaysia or perhaps Indonesia, how would you assess the extent of concerns among political parties and the public about who benefits most from Chinese presence and investment? And then the final part of the question is, to what extent is the use of Chinese investment for a local elite legitimation a widespread concern?
Yes. So in some ways, we do see a direct linkage between Chinese economic presence and incumbent elite empowerment, right? So this is, and I think many people have actually talked about, there's other studies, for example, specifically on this kind of elite empowerment, elite legitimization in Southeast Asia. And this is because the common practice of, let's say, a Chinese state, sometimes Chinese actors like business and etc., they tend to go through incumbent elite channels, right? Either to influence the government policies or to strike a deal on certain projects and etc. And then usually it is the incumbent elites will get money, right? Either corruption or other things, basically from this kind of engagement. So then we can see that there is usually it is the incumbent political parties and then the affiliated elites who benefit from these, right? So that's why I think that the opposition usually will not get as much from this kind of elite engagement, but usually it is the incumbent parties. So I think your comments on, let's say, the elite legitimization is definitely a good, valid one, right? I think that there is definitely a linkage between Chinese economic presence in Southeast Asia, and then it tend to use this kind of network, kind of guanxi kind of relations, to build up its relations with the incumbent, and that's in the end lead to cases of let's say corruption or other kind of political influence. You're mute, Rachel.
More from Ragini Panwar. She asks you if you could speak a bit more about the diaspora aspect of Chinese presence, which I know is in later chapters of the book, and how you would see this aspect manifest in countries with Chinese diaspora origin populations like Indonesia or Malaysia. It's in a minority position.
Right. So the relationship between Chinese state and the Chinese diaspora as waves of migration from China to Southeast Asia is varied. And in some ways, this has to do, on the one hand, obviously, of Chinese state actions, right, in its diaspora engagement policies. And then also previously, there is this competition between Beijing and Taipei for influence or winning the hearts of the overseas Chinese community in Southeast Asia. So that is also a Taiwan kind of linkage. But finally, there's also the actions, policies by a variety of Southeast Asian government to deal with the Chinese minorities in their own country. And here, on this particular dimension, there are actually quite a lot of variations, right? In terms of, on the one hand, for example, we can say that in Thailand's case, the previous stages of, let's say, high pressure for assimilation, for basically changing names and then speak Thai and then naturalization, etc. Basically lead to a very successful case of assimilation, where in the end, the Sino-Thais cease to be Chinese in a way that basically they no longer speak the language, and then they already changed the names, etc. You cannot easily identify who's Chinese, who's not, right? So that in some ways make being ethnic Chinese no longer a political liability. So that means in Thailand's context, being ethnic Chinese is not politically sensitive. So that's why these days you can see many politicians openly proclaim they are ethnic Chinese, and that will not become political liability for themselves. So that has, in some ways, been sort of, I should say, we can say that is, you can see in Thailand's case, that is actually ongoing phase of re-sinicization. Many people are really retracing their ethnic roots, reclaiming this kind of Chinese linkages. But in other countries, such as in Malaysia, as well Indonesia, Indonesia, for example, previously also in some ways they put more repressive measures, right, on being Chinese. So in these two countries, continue to be the case that there is this institutional, institutionalization of a separate identity, right? In Malaysia's case, right, Chinese is a very distinct racial category. So that, in some sense, continue to politicize being ethnic Chinese in these two countries. And then that means that when the Chinese state engage with ethnic Chinese communities in these countries, they tend to have political sensitivities, right? In a way that the governments, for example, sometimes will, like a few years ago, the Chinese ambassador to Malaysia commented on domestic politics in Malaysia, and that leads to kind of retaliation from Malaysian government saying that this is not your business. So that kind of thing, in some ways, has more to do with domestic politics within Indonesia and Malaysia, rather than, let's say, the Chinese state sort of direct engagement with diaspora community. On the other hand, I do see that these days the Chinese state has deliberately tried to make use of its diaspora community in Southeast Asia as asset, right? So this is in some ways quite standard. Many countries have these kind of linkages with their diaspora communities in the world, around the world, India, Mexico, and in some ways that's not really anything unique in that. But in Southeast Asia, definitely you can say that the overseas Chinese community is probably the largest ethnic minority in that sense, right, being present in the region. So in this case, the Chinese state engagement with those communities in Southeast Asia, then at least some of them, right, not everybody, right, some of them benefit from linkages with Chinese state and its economies, right? They can strike deals, they help facilitate dialogues and networks and bribing and many other things. So these ones, then they can basically become become a political problem, right? So recently, for example, Singaporean state just a few weeks ago, right, identified a Hong Kong, or somebody originally from Hong Kong as a foreign agent because he was facilitating, lots of meetings, dialogues, etc., between the Chinese embassy and the Chinese networks and the Singaporean government, etc. Right. So things like that, basically, these kind of networks, right? The Chinese state and its actors tend to make use of its guanxi, right, network, and then usually those network tend to be ethnic Chinese businesses, politicians in the region, and then these kind of avenues, right, of influence, and then often tend to manifest through this kind of diaspora politics. So I think hopefully that answers some of your interest on this question.
Thank you so much. So I would like to take my chair's prerogative and ask one last question. But before I do that, I do want to say to everyone who's listening in that a lot of these questions are really grappled with in a really beautifully sustained, thorough, and compelling manner in all the chapters of the book. So I really can't recommend enough that people read the entire book. And the last piece that I would like to just ask you about, which you started to discuss a little bit in your presentation, but is more thoroughly engaged in the book, is this metaphor of the ripple effect. And if you could say a little bit more about why you chose that as a title and what that really means for you in terms of the way you're thinking about China's presence, which I know is also a very deliberate title word. Rather than influence, you put presence. And I'm interested in why also, last part, why influence is often in scare quotes in the book.
Yeah. So I think, at the beginning of the presentation, I tried to conceptually differentiate influence, which involve a specific intentionality, right? I want to influence you because there's a particular intention on my part. Versus this kind of ripple effect in a way that things happen just simply because the presence of China in the region. So that's why I think there is deliberate separation between the two. Now, why this particular phrase of ripple effect? Well, I benefited this phrase from Don Emerson from Stanford. He sort of previously the title was Unintended Consequences, which he thinks Don considers were too cumbersome, then in the end, I came across this ripple effect, and that sounds much more catchy, so that's why I decided to use the word ripple effect. But then I think what I try to, I think this, I get back to my earlier comments, and this, geographical proximity and a demographic factor, and I think that is, that make China's relation with Southeast Asia very distinct, right? Just because so many people coming out from China, they're now going to Southeast Asia, right? This is the closest place that they can go, right? And then these days, you think about, let's say, visa-free regimes, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand recently introduced visa-free for Chinese tourists. And so this, in some ways, is only going to accelerate the pace of this outbound China, and then sort of more intensified this kind of encounters between the Chinese people and then the local societies, for better or worse, right? So particularly on migration encounters, many things happen in the end, not necessarily pleasantly, right? But then still that we cannot easily escape from the presence of China, right? In a way that simply just because China is there, and then Southeast Asia is so close, right? And that's why the ripple effect of China in Southeast Asia is going to be wide-ranging and then long-lasting in a way.
Well, I really thank you again, Enze-Han, for sharing this incredible book with us. And thank you to everyone who's here online. I hope that we get to see more of you and hear more about all the other chapters in this book at another time. And I just thank everyone for a really rich discussion today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Everyone. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.